Standing in stark contrast to the modern city of Cairo is the Giza Plateau. Its vast funerary complex would include both the pyramids of the pharaohs Khufu and his son Khafre. They were colossal monuments to the power of their builders, but they were also signposts to the end of an era. After nearly 200 years of building larger and larger pyramids, the last pharaoh to build at Giza would only manage to complete one that was scarcely one-third the size of its neighbors. One question continues to confound scholars, and that is, why? It was the year 2532 BC that ushered in the rule of the pharaoh Menkaure. He would become the fifth in a family line of rulers to inherit the throne during what was called the Fourth Dynasty. The son of the pharaoh Khafre, Menkaure probably inherited a kingdom where the colossal building projects of his grandfathers had tested the limits of royal authority. The cost of conscripting and supporting hundreds of thousands of laborers to build the Great Pyramids at Giza may well have been too high. The 5th century BC historian Herodotus chronicled in Greek that for 106 years Egypt had been in great misery because its temples had been shut by Khufu and Khafre to make more time for work. Disapproving his father's deeds, Menkaure is said to have reopened the temples and let the people worship freely once more. The stone portraits that the pharaoh Menkaure had carved of himself are thought to symbolize his good nature. Here he stands alongside his favorite of 3 wives. She is Camera Nebte. In an unusual display of humanity and compassion, she reaches out to hold him, while her left hand rests comfortably on his arm. According to legend, Menkaure's benevolent rule was an affront to the gods. They had decreed that Egypt should be oppressed for 150 years, and the 2 kings before him knew this, but not he.
He was a good king, and he upset the gods because he was going against their prophecy. So they therefore said, in their revenge, if you like, right, we will just allow you to live for 6 years, and then we shall revert to the mayhem of the previous reigns. Well, Menkaure wasn't happy with this, and he decided that he would endeavour to cheat the gods. And the legends tell us that he called for the candles to be brought, and they were lit at night, so he lived night and day.
In this way, Menkaure reasoned he could rule twice as long each day and double his time from 6 years to 12 as the benign pharaoh of Egypt. The pharaoh Menkaure would in fact rule by candlelight for 28 years, until 2505 BC. He would build a relatively small pyramid, even though he had plenty of time on the throne to build a larger one. Scholars are left to ponder his reasons for this. Was it economic strain, or was the power of the pharaoh in doubt?
Menkaure's pyramid is the smallest of the 3 at Giza, and it is really hard to know why that's the case. His reign was not very long, but we know of pharaohs who had relatively short reigns who still built very large monuments. And I think the reason why there's this variation is not something spectacular like a weak pharaoh. I think that basically the scale was not so important as the monument itself.
Others speculate it was the pharaoh's choice of building materials that led to his decision.
We don't know why the Pyramid of Menkaure is the smallest of the 3 at Giza. It may have had to do with a desire to incorporate more hard-to-work stone In other words, the lower part of his pyramid was certainly intended to be cased with granite, which is certainly harder to work and more difficult than limestone, which is the primary building material of all the rest of the pyramids. But there really is no answer to that question. There is no answer to the question of why Khufu's is the largest, or why Khafra's is precisely the size it is.
What is recorded is that the pharaoh Menkare's rule brought the end of the fourth dynasty. It ushered in a period of change and a new line of pharaohs that started a new dynasty. In 2498 BC, the fifth dynasty in ancient Egypt began with the reign of the pharaoh Userkaf. Userkaf, whose name meant "his soul is powerful," was the great-grandson of the pharaoh Khufu and ensured his kingship by marrying the daughter of the earlier pharaoh, Menkare. Userkaf's time on the throne was brief, long enough for him to reject the tradition of his predecessors who were buried in pyramids at the Giza Plateau and build his pyramid back in Saqqara. Now badly deteriorated, it stands almost in the shadow of the step pyramid of Djoser. The pharaoh Userkaf would also begin a religious cult that worshipped only the sun. The temple he built for this worship has long since been destroyed, but scholars have pieced together its description from the legacy of solar temples that would follow.
The Sun Temple of Userkaf, like the others, consisted of a benben or obelisk, the symbol of the sun, which sat on a podium, and in front of it was a large courtyard with an altar or offering place. And they seem to have undertaken offerings to the sun at that site. And these sun temples may have also been very closely connected with expressing the direct association of the king and the sun god, because in the afterlife, the king became directly associated with the sun god.
The fifth dynasty of Egyptian rulers would survive 150 years. Its final pharaoh was called Unas. He followed his immediate predecessors by also building at Saqqara. He named his pyramid the Pyramid which is Beautiful of Places. And while the outside of his pyramid has badly deteriorated, the interior still holds the first words written on the walls of pyramids. These were the pyramid texts. These hieroglyphs are a collection of spells designed to help the pharaoh Unas cross over into the afterlife. From words formed in stone, these instructions were collected by ancient scribes and written on papyrus. Meticulously illustrated, these writings became known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. One of the most prized works of ancient Egyptian culture, this guidebook to the afterlife would be read and recited by the Egyptians for 2,000 years.
Hail Unas, his existence is for all eternity. Thy essence is in heaven, thy body on earth. The seat of the heart of Unas is among those who live upon this earth forever and ever and ever.
The fifth dynasty ended here, and with the demise of the pharaoh Unas in 2345 BC, there followed the sixth dynasty and a pharaoh whose name was Pepi. A small alabaster statue of Pepi reveals that, like earlier pharaohs, he would have the hawk god Horus associated with him. Here, however, the bird stands aloof and detached on the back of Pepi's throne. Interestingly, this most central of gods seems to be looking away from the pharaoh. Inscriptions from Pepi's reign record that Pepi's upper class was gaining wealth and becoming influential. His absolute rule from Memphis was becoming unstable. His kingdom was heading for disaster. This bronze statue of Pepi I depicts him in the twilight of his 50-year reign. When he died in 2283 BC, he would be succeeded to the throne by his son Pepi II, a boy only 6 years old. The new pharaoh was a boy named Pepi, after his father. At the age of 6, Pepi II was acknowledged as ruler of all of Egypt. But what practical leadership would a 6-year-old have to offer a growing country?
There were a few examples of pharaohs who came to the throne very young, such as Pepi II, who was probably only about 6 years old when he came to the throne. And what a 6-year-old pharaoh did was he did what he was told. You could bet that even though he was considered to be divine in nature and theoretically holding the supreme political power, there would be a council of advisors who would actually run the kingdom until he came of sufficient age to be really regarded as a pharaoh.
Still, the young pharaoh did wield influence. 2 years into his reign, during a trading expedition south to Aswan, word came back to the excitable 8-year-old King Pepi that a dancing pygmy had been captured to bring back to Egypt.
Come northward at once to the court. We must bring the dwarf alive, sound, and well, to rejoice and gladden the heart of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. When he comes down with you into the ship, appoint reliable people who shall take care lest he should fall into the water. If you arrive at the court and the dwarf is with you alive and well, my majesty will make you many excellent honors.
Even a child pharaoh would be treated with enormous respect, and certainly any requests he had, people would try to put them into effect and would record them, because from their point of view, he is already manifesting the divine aspect of a pharaoh. And even though in the real world of politics, they're keeping a tight hold on things, in terms of his personal life, they're certainly going to interpret it as a manifestation of the divine aspect of rulership and to indulge him in what he wants.
During the childhood reign of Pepi II, at the end of the 6th dynasty, pharaonic authority disintegrated. There is evidence that various administrators declared themselves independent. From what written evidence we have, it appears a sort of feudalistic regime was established.
The nobles are full of misery, and the low classes are full of joy. Gold, lapis, silver, and turquoise hang on the necks of slave women, while ladies walk the streets wrapped in rags. He who once did not even possess sandals, today is the master of treasure.
Control moved away from Memphis. The king depleted his treasury, bestowing gifts on his nobles, and with the death of Pepi II in 2180 BC, the kingdom of Egypt collapsed. For more than 1,000 years, the desert-backed cliffs of the Nile Valley had given shelter and protection to the Egyptian civilization that had flourished here. By the year 2180 BC, the ancient Egyptians had brought about magnificent achievements in arts, science, and technology. In architecture, towering pyramids had sprung from the original flat mud mastabas. The art of writing had been elevated from simple wall relief to the elaborate literature of the pyramid texts. This period, called the Old Kingdom in ancient Egypt, became the yardstick by which all later Egyptian achievement would be measured. Surrounded by natural splendor and man-made wonders, historians suggest that the Egyptians had become complacent. Now a process that had begun with the reign of Pepi II, the pharaoh who inherited Egypt's throne as a child, led to a breakdown of the country in 2184 BC. A period of transition followed that lasted 40 years and 4 dynasties. The precise reasons for this decline are unknown. The ancient writings are quiet about this shadowy period, save for a poem that has partially survived on papyrus.
See now, things are done that never were done before. The king has been robbed by beggars. See, one buried as a hawk is. What the pyramid hid is empty. See now, the land is deprived of kingship by a few people who ignore custom.
Records from the region of Heracleopolis show that a series of temporary kings ruled Lower Egypt from here, splitting the country into 2 lands again. Upper Egypt was controlled from the newly founded city of Thebes. The ancients described this period of instability as a time of 70 kings in 70 days. In fact, this period of chaos would last nearly 200 years. Out of the collapse of the Old Kingdom, there emerged the figure of a king again. This was Mentuhotep, the first to reunify all of Egypt. Mentuhotep referred to himself as uniter of the 2 lands, and the first part of his reign saw fighting and military campaigns aimed at crushing any cities that dared revolt against his rule.
Mentuhotep I is really one of these very dynamic rulers of Egypt, really one of the greatest pharaohs, because he comes at a time when Egypt was divided internally, politically fragmented. And during his reign, he succeeded in reunifying Egypt and laying the groundwork for this period during which Egypt again becomes highly organized and centralized, and the kingship becomes very powerful.
The pharaoh Mentuhotep ruled from Thebes, which was now the capital city, and a site that would one day be known for its temples of Karnak and Luxor. Even in Mentuhotep's time, this was a large and powerful city. The ancients referred to it as the city of 1,000 gates. As a building project, it reflected the stability and prosperity that Egypt once again enjoyed under the pharaoh Mentuhotep. But Mentuhotep was not seen as a god-king like his predecessors had been during the time of the pyramids. To reflect this, he would erect a new style of mortuary temple for himself before an impressive backdrop of cliffs here in ancient Thebes, at a site named Dar el-Bahari. The complex was dug into the rock, a blend of traditional mastaba and pyramid of a god. This style of tomb building oddly confirms the power of Mentuhotep's rule. He was a half-divine and half-mortal leader. Underneath the temple, a larger-than-life-size stone statue of the pharaoh Mentuhotep was found. He is seated and depicted in his Hebsed robe, the robe he would have worn at the festival of his renewal. Nearby was uncovered an inscription of his queen named Kawit. Here she is depicted eternally having her hair arranged by a servant. Another artifact from the tomb depicts the princess Ashed, relaxing as she enjoys the fragrance of a lotus blossom. Such scenes underline this period of peace and stability, a period that would continue under a pharaoh who would change the way Egypt viewed its rulers forever. By the year 1878 BC, this brooding, careworn figure would ascend to the throne of ancient Egypt. He was Sesostris III.
Sesostris III is really well known because of the large number of portrait statues which we have from him. They're very vivid and tend to present an image of the king as possibly taking the role of kingship very seriously, interested in presenting his image as a wise and careful ruler who is really concerned with maintaining the strength of the kingship.
His name meant man of power, but he was unlike earlier pharaohs whose portraits portrayed them as gods. The statues we have of the pharaoh Sesostris III depict a natural and realistic face. Heavy eyelids, creases in his face, and a straight, thin-lipped mouth seem to convey both the sorrow and concerns that would be expected of a strong military leader.
Sesostris III is very much remembered as a pharaoh who had a strong interest in the military, and particularly his activities in Nubia testify to his interest in extending the power of Egypt and maintaining its borders.
During his reign, Sesostris III extended and expanded a system of mud brick fortresses which the Egyptians had established in Lower Nubia, now northern Sudan. From here he could acquire building materials and extend the influence of Egypt into this frontier.
The area of Upper Nubia during that time was the center of a very powerful culture which we know as the Kerma culture. Sesostris III really was interested in maintaining Egypt's border against the Kerma culture.
A stone stela preserves the pharaoh's description of his campaign.
I made my boundary. I went further south than my forefathers. I increased what was bequeathed to me. I captured their women and brought off their workers who entered their wells and drove their cattle. I cut their grain and placed fire therein.
Much of the wealth he secured during his Nubian campaigns was marked for use in building temples in Egypt. Here in the capital city of Thebes, he erected an elaborate temple, which has since been destroyed, that was dedicated to the god Mantu, the ancient Egyptian lord of warfare. But such confidence in the gods and in the power of war were impermanent. Within 200 years, the proud people of Egypt would be quietly invaded. Egypt would again become a land of turmoil. There are no monuments to celebrate their rule. No image of their faces has ever been found. Yet ancient writings attest to the fact that in 1663 BC, Egypt came under the control of foreign kings of Semitic origin. These pharaohs were called the Hyksos.
We don't know the exact process by which the Hyksos took over the country. It appears at the moment that possibly it was partly by infiltrating into the delta and increasing their numbers. There may also have been an actual invasion component, although this is still somewhat debated.
If it was invasion, the Hyksos swept across the land, bringing with them superior weaponry like the compound bow. They would also introduce the horse and the chariot to Egypt. The ancients called these horse-drawn vehicles the ships that sailed upon the desert. There is evidence that the Hyksos used these to plunder the cultural and political center of Egypt, Memphis. The result was the 16th dynasty, a dynasty of foreign rule for Egypt that lasted 108 years.
They didn't like this. It caused a profound impact on the Egyptian psyche. And when the Egyptians roared back with control of their country, they seem to have driven the Hyksos out with what I can best characterize as a never again attitude. They did not like being controlled by foreigners, and they did not want it to happen again.
With the foreign kings expelled, the Egyptians looked within their borders and witnessed the start of a new kingdom. It would begin here in the ancient city of Thebes. The pharaohs of the new kingdom were indeed godlike beings. Their immense monuments and temples have left an imprint on the face of Egypt that has survived for 3 millennia. This new kingdom marked the beginning of the 18th dynasty, or family line of pharaohs. It started in 1570 BC with the pharaoh Ahmose. A mosaic from his time depicts him in a ritual bath or purification ceremony. It is Ahmose who is credited with sealing Egypt's borders with Syria and Nubia to keep the country safe from invaders. Evidence of his military leadership is recorded on his ceremonial gold battle axe, which depicts him smiting his enemy. Although Ahmose's tomb was plundered for the treasures that would have been stored inside, his mummy has remained intact. This gives us the unique opportunity to look upon the face of the pharaoh who stood at the beginning of Egypt's new kingdom, the pharaoh Ahmose. The face of a successor, Thutmose I, has also survived in its mummified form. Thutmose I would come to rule Egypt in the year 1535 BC. Although his reign was short and lasted only 6 years, the pharaoh Thutmose I is credited with a set of brilliant military campaigns that pushed the southern frontier of Egypt farther into the mineral-rich lands of Nubia than any pharaoh before him. An inscription he left at the religious site of Abydos records these deeds in his own words.
I made the boundaries of Egypt as far as that which the sun encircles. I made Egypt the superior of every land.
The name Thutmose meant born of the god of Thoth, a tribute to the Egyptian lord of the moon and wisdom. Before his death in 1518 BC, after a reign of only 6 years, Thutmose passed his royal name on to his son. He would be called Thutmose II. The Egyptian royal families were the only Egyptians to encourage marriage between brother and sister. In this way, they kept their royal bloodline and their right to the throne safely within the family. For this reason, Thutmose II married his half-sister. She was called Hatshepsut, a name that meant foremost of noble ladies. Thutmose II and Hatshepsut would rule as king and queen for 14 years. As a pharaoh, he was only a shadow of the powerful man his father had been. The reign of Thutmose II was mostly uneventful. When he died at the age of 30, his death left a great problem for the royal family. The only eligible male heir he had fathered was a young boy not yet 12 years old. The boy's mother was a harem girl named Isis. The boy would be named Thutmose III.
It was this individual, who was, of course, the nephew of Hatshepsut, who had the closest claim to the throne as the most immediate male heir of the deceased king. However, apparently because he was fairly young, Hatshepsut was able to have herself installed as a regential figure and to rule in a co-regency with him for over 2 decades.
But after 2 years as co-regent with the boy Thutmose III, Queen Hatshepsut had herself crowned pharaoh. In 1498 BC, she became ruler of Egypt, the richest and most powerful country on earth. Nestled in the foothills below the cliffs of Dar el-Bahari, near ancient Thebes, stands a masterpiece. This is the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. She called it the garden of my father Amun, who was the most powerful god in Thebes. It was indeed an elegant garden. Trees and green shrubs once lined its graceful entrance ramps, and there is evidence that its colonnade and sanctuary shared the same adornment. More than a temple, however, it was a propaganda machine that Hatshepsut used to underscore her right to the throne. On its walls she had inscribed scenes that depict her father, Thutmose I, who was long dead, installing her as king.
Many of the scenes we have from Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri present in kind of very idealized ways the nature of her kingship and really attempt to strengthen her claim. So this text that we have is not an historical document, but a document which was essentially fabricated by Hatshepsut in order to strengthen her claim to the kingship.
At the temple of Karnak, she consolidated her power through worship with the priests of the temple of Amun. These were powerful priests because it was believed that the strength of the pharaoh emanated from this god. Although such ritual ceremonies were closed to women, as pharaoh, Hatshepsut could enter the inner domain of the god. Outside the temple, she commissioned the building of a spectacular obelisk to commemorate her relationship with the god of the sun. Although she was not noted as a military leader, Queen Hatshepsut is noted for her trading expeditions to a land called Punt, now modern Somalia. Temple inscriptions show her fleet setting off on the Red Sea and exchanging jewels and acquiring incense trees for the Queen Pharaoh. Such affairs were administered for the pharaoh Hatshepsut by a common man named Senemut. Senemut seemed to have been at Hatshepsut's side for much of her life, and statues of him depict him carefully holding or teaching Hatshepsut's daughter, the Princess Neferu. In Senemut's time, close connections like these led to rumors suggesting that he owed his good fortune to intimate relations with the queen. Off to the side and deep below Hatshepsut's temple complex, Senemut built his tomb. The fact that it was constructed so close to the queen's temple is another factor that fuels the speculation about their possible love affair. The pharaoh Hatshepsut died in 1483 BC, but any records of her demise seem to have been mysteriously destroyed. Some speculate that Thutmose III, the boy she had kept from the throne, had a hand in her death. What we do know is that he hated her. Now he would try to destroy her spirit. He waited nearly 20 years to take his rightful place as the pharaoh of all of Egypt. For nearly 20 years he was kept in the background, appearing to worship the queen who had usurped him. This was Thutmose III, the boy who had inherited the throne only to see it taken from him by his caretaker, Queen Hatshepsut. With the death of Queen Hatshepsut, Thutmose III came into his rightful inheritance. In 1504 BC, he would become the celebrated pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty. During the time that the young Thutmose had been kept in the background under the rule of Hatshepsut, he probably went through military training, and like other noblemen in his time, learned how to shoot a bow and arrow and how to handle a chariot in the desert terrain. By the second year of his reign, his military prowess became evident. Records from this time chronicle a period of 18 years, during which Thutmose III led a series of battles and campaigns along the coast of Syria. These won him great riches, and has led historians to compare him to Napoleon.
Thutmose is called the Napoleon of Egypt because he was one of the most successful military figures in the history of Egyptian kingship. He directed a whole series of major campaigns, many more than most pharaohs, in the Levant and in the Eastern Mediterranean, and he was directly involved in a great deal of those himself.
Of the many temples that were embellished and expanded with the spoils of Thutmose III's military campaigns, none was more dazzling than the work he did at the Temple of Karnak in the ancient city of Thebes. At the east end of the complex, Thutmose III would construct his festival temple. Unique in the design of Egyptian temples, its unusually shaped columns are thought to represent the poles of his military tent. The other walls and columns here were shaped and carved to represent the variety of animals and plants that the pharaoh brought back from his campaign in Syria. The whole building project was supervised by the pharaoh's vizier or high officer, whose name we know as Rekhmire. Here, a wall painting preserves a scene of Rekhmire as he inspects the brick-making efforts of the king's laborers. A prolific builder, Thutmose III was also a determined destroyer. Within 20 years of Queen Hatshepsut's death, he and an army of followers descended upon everything that bore her name or likeness and destroyed it. Thutmose III, it seems, was furious that this woman had usurped his place on the throne, and now he would retaliate. The statues in her temple were destroyed. Some were beheaded, while others were simply smashed. Her face was chiseled out of wall reliefs anywhere they could be found. Records of her time on the throne were obliterated. Even statues of her chief officer and companion, Sennemut, were not above defacement. This was the ancient equivalent of a book burning. By eliminating her image and name, the pharaoh Thutmose III believed he could eliminate her memory and even eliminate her soul. During this period, the 18th dynasty of pharaohs had never fully beheld one of the greatest monuments ever built by their culture. Now more than 1,000 years old, the Great Sphinx built at Giza had literally been covered by the sands of time. It was a new pharaoh, Thutmose IV, who would free the sand-obstructed Sphinx during his first year of reign in 1419 BC. His story is recorded on a giant tablet that still rests between the paws of this great desert beast.
What we see here is a reproduction of the Great Sphinx tablet. The inscription on the tablet begins here in the upper right and gives the date when it was set up in the king's reign. And then it recounts an extraordinary event that took place in his life. Further down here, where the king went out one day in order to hunt ostriches and lions in the desert beyond the pyramids. And taking a break from his hunting out in the western desert, he decided to take a nap underneath the shadow of the head of the Sphinx.
Napping in the shadow of the Sphinx, the king reported a vision in which the great beast spoke to him.
Look at me, Thutmose, my son. I am your father in the horizon. I promise you a gift, earthly rule at the head of all the living. All the territory on which the eye of the sun rests will be yours. To you I turn my face and heart for protection, since I am sick in all my limbs. The sands of the holy place upon which I rest have covered me.
And if you take care of my image, clear it away, tidy it up, and build a small shrine to it, then I shall cause you to become not only a king of Egypt, but one of the greatest kings that Egypt has known.
Thutmose IV reigned over a stable and prosperous Egypt for 33 years. But it was the sand-clearing operation he carried out here that seems to have been his greatest achievement. What followed was a time of opulence. For 100 years, Egypt would bask in an abundance of gold and riches. The ancient Egyptians would witness an outpouring of artistic talent and devotion to a pantheon of gods. But in the midst of this period of peace and ostentation, Egypt would be plunged into a crisis. It began under a strangely distorted figure of a man who would soon rise to power as Pharaoh.